Hi, my name is Cody. I'm a software engineer here in San Francisco. In this video series, we're creating a Ruby on Rails application from scratch. We're doing this mainly as an educational thing, just so we can kind of learn Ruby on Rails, but we're also doing this to educate about how to use AI in Ruby on Rails applications. To do that, we're recreating a project of mine that's called LlamaPress, which is basically just a database for large language model generated web pages that has HTML, JavaScript, and CSS code in it. In the last video, we created our initial Rails project, and in this video, we're going to start setting up some of the scaffolding. We're going to commit all of our code to GitHub, and we're also going to do a high-level overview and architecture of Ruby on Rails and the Model View Controller MVC framework, which is what Ruby on Rails does for its web application. All right, let's jump right into it. So the first thing I actually want to do is let's go ahead and open up Cursor here, and let's click on this Branches tab. And we have all of these changes that these are basically just the initialization of our application. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and click on the top change and then scroll to the bottom and click Shift and then click, and that basically just highlights all of these changes. Then we're going to click on this little plus button which stages these changes, and we're going to go ahead and type in a commit message. We're going to say initial commit for our LlamaPress project. Okay, and then we're going to go ahead and click on publish, and it's going to want us to sign into GitHub if you haven't signed in yet. I might already be signed in with Cursor, so it already knows, and it just created a brand new repository for me. You might have to basically register with GitHub and authenticate it with Cursor or VS Code if you're using VS Code. And then let's just see if this worked. Okay, awesome. So this just created our application here in GitHub, which I will also make public just so everyone can see. Let's go ahead and change this visibility, change it to public. Okay, there we go. Now that's all public. Great. Okay, so the next step is we were looking at our project kind of structure, and we were looking at this app folder, and this app folder is a really important folder. In fact, I'm gonna go ahead and pull it up on our Mac as well, just so you can kind of see the folder explorer view versus the kind of list view. But we have our app folder right here, and this app folder has some really important folders inside of it. Assets is where it saves JavaScript, images, it saves CSS, style sheets. You see we have our Tailwind folder in here that has our .css file. And then it also has things like JavaScript, where if you have like if you want to have a React front end or some sort of other kind of JavaScript front end, then you can save a bunch of your things in here. But the most important ones is actually our models right here, our views, and our controllers. So moving out of the Mac view and back into Cursor, we have our models right here, our views, and then our controllers. And this is kind of the main application logic for the entire app, is going to live in these three folders. I'm going to do a quick review of model view architecture and how it all kind of relates with Rails. Okay, and so this is just going to go into a little bit of the basics of how web applications work in general. But what we do is we have, so how a web application works is you have a browser right here. So this is going to be a browser. This is going to be something like, Chrome. Could be Safari, Firefox, etc. And you're going to have your user right here that is using, the browser on their computer. And they're going to open up a new tab, and they're going to use a URL, right? In this case, they would go to something like llamapress.ai, which is just a URL. And when they do that, what it's going to do is the browser is going to go to our server, to our LlamaPress server, and basically just going to say, hey, we have a user that wants you to do this thing for it, right? So they go to llamapress.ai, that goes to our server, and it's going to basically say, hey, you have a request from a user, and so, please respond accordingly. And in this case, the server is going to see that request, and it's going to handle this request, and it's going to create a web page. And a web page just has 3 components. It has HTML code, it has CSS code, and it has JavaScript code. Okay. And what our server is going to do is it's going to grab those 3 things, and it's going to format an HTML page, and then it's going to send it back to the browser. Okay. We'll send page back to browser. Okay. And what the browser does, this is what's happening when the browser is loading and thinking, is it's going off to the server, it's getting its request, it's creating an HTML, CSS, JavaScript page, and then once the browser gets that request, it then loads it into an actual web page, right? And this is where you'd get things like, you'd have like an H1 tag, right? That's like the title of the page. It'd be like LlamaPress, right? And you'd have like some forms. So maybe this is like maybe this form right here was like the instructions to LlamaBot about like what you wanted to build. Maybe this one was like the email that you're registering with. Maybe this one's like the password. And it's all like a form, right? And this is basically how web browsers and web applications work in general. You ask for a web page from the server, and then the server responds with a actual web page with the HTML, the CSS, the JavaScript code, and then the browser renders that for the user to see. Now in this case, our server is actually Rails, right? So Ruby on Rails is the actual web server in this scenario. And that's why when we went to run our project, we ran Rails space server, and that's how we are telling Rails to start the server. Okay. And the other thing is, it's not just loading web pages. You can also submit data to the server. So in the case of having like a form on a web page, maybe this field right here is like email. Maybe this one is password. Maybe this one up here is prompt, right? And what this is just a form. And when the user clicks on this, let's say this like submit button, then what the browser does is it will basically send this form to the server, basically saying, hey, the user is sending you information, take this information and save it to the database, right? Because in this case, we're creating a new sign-in. We're signing the user is registering for an account, let's say, in this form. And let's go ahead and send that to the server. And in this case, the server isn't just going to simply respond with a web page. It also needs to save that data somehow. And that's where a database comes into play. So we have our server on one hand, and then we have a database on the other hand. And so in this case, our database is Postgres. Now you can use different databases with Rails. You don't have to use Postgres, but Postgres is kind of the industry standard right now. You can use things like SQLite. I think by default Rails initializes with SQLite, at least it used to. But when we created the app, we did that dash database equals Postgres. And so that's why we set up the configuration to be with Postgres. So in this case, the user sent a form to the server, and there's data in this form, right? Such as in the form of email, password, maybe the prompt, right? And once we get to our web server here, to Rails, Rails needs to save this data. And so what it does is it does this very smoothly, and it just sends it to the database, and the database just saves it. And That's how data persists in a web application and with Rails and specifically. And then what it does is after that data is saved, if it's saved successfully, then we basically just send a response back that's saying, hey, we're good to go. Okay. Then we'll send and that, basically say, yes, we're good. You saved the data to the database. And we'll also give them a URL to redirect them to a different web page, right? If it's not saved, let's say there was an error. If not saved, let's say the database threw some sort of error or there was some sort of problem, we still send a response to the browser, but we just tell the browser, no, sorry, that didn't work. And that's kind of the control flow of an application. Now, when we're sending these requests back and forth, you have to understand that there's different types of requests. So for example, this request right here, where we're first loading the web page, this first request, this is a different type of request than the one where we're saving data to the database, right? In this case, we're just loading a page to the browser, and we're just responding with an HTML web page. And so it's a very different type of request than, this second type of request where we're actually telling the server to save information to a database, right? And so this is true for all web applications, and it's part of just how the web works in general. But there's a protocol, a networking protocol called HTTP, right? And this HTTP protocol is just how basically it's communicating, it's setting the standards for how your web application, your web page, is going to communicate with a server, right? And in HTTP, there's a handful of different actions that you can do. And this is a little bit philosophical, but it's good to think through it. And the different types of actions that you can do all revolve around data, right? And if you think about from a database point of view, there's a handful of actions that you can do. You can either create a new record, right? Create new record in the database. In the case of our user registration example, we're creating a user to the database table. You also might want to read an existing record. So maybe you have an existing user account and you actually want to sign in instead of creating a brand new user, right? The other thing is you could update an existing record. So let's say you have an existing user in your database and you want to change the first name from Cody, to Jim or something like that. So you can update an existing record. And the last thing that you can do is you can actually delete a record. So maybe you want to delete your account for whatever reason, or maybe a user wants to delete their account. And so that's the last action you can do. And this is a common pattern across all types of data applications. You're either going to be creating a record, reading a record, updating a record, or deleting a record. Wow. And so the way that HTTP works and web applications in general work is that for each of these actions, you actually have a very specific way for the browser to communicate to the server that it wants to do one of these things. Might want to create a new record, read an existing record, update a record, or delete a record. And so there's corresponding actions in HTTP. Okay, so there's these different ways of doing things. You can create, read, update, or delete. In the case of one, in our example where we are loading a web page from the server, we are actually just reading from the server. We're not trying to add any data to the server. We're not trying to update any data. We're not trying to delete anything. And so in this case, for reading, we're actually trying to do what's called a GET request. And this GET request tells the server, like the browser's telling the server, hey, we just need to get this resource. That's all it is, okay? The other thing we can do is we can create a new record. So in the case of this second example, when we're trying to save data to the database, we're trying to register a new user. This one's going to be create a brand new record, okay, a brand new record. In this case, we use what's called a post request, okay? This is basically you're posting data to the server saying, save this information, this is important information, and you're telling the server, you know, the browser is telling the server, we need to save this information, okay? If you're trying to update an existing record, let's say you have an existing user and you have an ID, the user's loaded, maybe you're trying to change the first name of the user, or you're trying to reset the password, or you're trying to change the email, then in this case, you're going to do a put request, P-U-T, okay? And the browser sends this put request to the server, and the server is going to respond accordingly. And lastly, we have this delete an existing record. In this case, we actually call this one is actually called a delete request. Okay, a delete request. And those are the 4 actions that you need to really understand if you want to understand Ruby on Rails. I mean, really, if you want to understand any level of websites and how the internet works, how browsers work, how to build a web application, these 4 things are really, really important. And it's important to understanding Rails. So based on all of this, we can now start to build up an intuition for model view controller, okay? Now we have our 3 components. We have our browser, we have our server, and we have our database. And the way that these 3 things interact is kind of the foundation for model view controller. So the browser, as we were talking about, is responsible for taking code and showing it to the user. So what it needs is it needs HTML, it needs CSS, and it needs JavaScript. And these are going to live in a folder that's called views, okay? These are views. These are basically just how the app looks, how it feels, how the user interacts with them. All files related to HTML, CSS, and JavaScript is going to live on a folder in the Rails server called views. And that's why we have this app folder, right? And then inside this folder, we have this folder called views right here. And this is going to be where all of the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript code lives on our server. Now, as far as the server, though, how does the browser get the views from the server? And there's an element of, like, you know, when you have a big web application, you end up having dozens of different pages, and maybe you have many different types of data. Maybe you have users, maybe you have settings for those users. In our case, for our application, we're going to have a list of a bunch of websites and pages, and it's going to store a bunch of things. And so we need to be able to very fine-tuned, like in a very granular way, be able to get the right information to the browser at the right time. And, you know, the user's going to click on a button and they're going to want to load a specific page, or they're going to want to send a specific piece of information to the server. And to handle all of that, basically how we control what gets shown to the user at what time, that's called a controller. And what the controller's job is to basically take a web request from the browser that is one of these types of web requests and do the right action. This might be that it needs to go and find the right page to send it back to the user so that the user can see a new page that is trying to load. Maybe that's like a GET request, right? The user's trying to get some sort of other URL route on the server. Maybe they're trying to update their user account, so it needs to be able to listen for put requests. The controller will listen for put requests, and then the browser will supply a user ID, and it will go and update that user with the new information. Or maybe they're trying to create a brand new record, so the server needs to listen for post requests. And then maybe you need to validate that the data that was sent in is actually what we need. Like maybe somebody forgot to put their password when they register for an account. So the controller is responsible for mapping these requests from the browser, for listening for GET requests, POST requests, PUT requests, and DELETE requests, and then taking the appropriate action when the time comes. So that's what the controllers are responsible for. They are probably the most core part of the application because it's responsible for mapping and being kind of the central part where all the code kind of flows through. And then lastly, we have our models. And what our models are responsible for is they're actually responsible for all of the in-depth kind of database interactions. So with a database, you have a set of database tables, and each table has its own set of columns. So you might have something like users, right? And then our users are going to have something like an email and a password. And all of this information gets saved into a database, which makes it very, very efficient when you're dealing with lots and lots of different types of data to basically keep track of all that information. It's really, really important that you have a well-designed database for your application. But there's going to be many, many different types of tables in your system. And what the models do with Ruby on Rails is they make it so that you don't have to write a bunch of SQL code all the time. And this is one of the magical things with Rails, but databases are actually pretty complex. And there's a lot of different ways to handle databases, but there's just a lot of annoying code that you have to write to access a database. You have to write a lot of SQL code, like select all from ... and there's a whole list of SQL commands and all sorts of things. And what's really nice about Ruby on Rails is that they kind of simplify this whole thing from you. So Rails really simplifies the database management side of things. And it does this by kind of abstracting it away and making it much, much simpler to deal with databases. And they do this through something that they call active record. Okay, and this is a Rails piece of magic. There are other frameworks that have similar types of tools, but Rails is probably, in my opinion, the most world-class implementation of this specific pattern. And what it does is, rather than having to, in your application, write all this SQL code of select all from user where ID equals this, like we are busy. We don't want to have to write all that code all the time. So what a model does is a model provides a clean, simple line of code to do really powerful things. So the example that we can run with here is with our model, we'll have something that's called a user, right? And then you can do things like user dot all, right? And that's a small little line of code that translates to a big nasty SQL statement. Select all from, table.users, right, ... And what's nice with Rails is if you can just kind of learn how active record works, then you don't have to memorize all this SQL code. But what's powerful is you can still use SQL if you want to for more complicated database things, but you don't really need to. And so the model's job is to basically provide this mapping from this really simple kind of active record approach, which is you just have a very simple and clean class, very simple and clean kind of object, and it does all of this nasty SQL code under the hood. You don't have to really worry about it. It just really, really, really simplifies things. So now there's kind of a rule where with model view controller, where model's responsible for things like database interactions. The controller is responsible for what we would call routing. So this would be like routing user request, like routing requests and serving, serving the front end, basically responding to the browser requests and giving the user the views that it needs to. And then the views are responsible for just the actual front end, look and feel, right? So this is your JavaScript, CSS, HTML. And that is basically MVC in a nutshell. It's a very, very important pattern if you want to understand Ruby on Rails. And that's why all of these folders live within the app folder. And there's one more piece that we're missing here, which is when the browser goes to the server, the first thing it goes to, it doesn't actually hit the controller at the very, very beginning. We have another important file, really, really important file, that that basically everything in the application runs through, and that's our file called routes.rb. And what these routes do is these routes basically take a URL from a browser. So let's go back to LlamaPress. It takes a URL on a browser, such as llamapress.ai/pages/4b1a3a5/preview, and it takes this route and from a URL in the browser, and it actually will map it to the right controller. So it goes to the controller and it basically says, hey, I've got this route that's like pages, and I need to figure out where this needs to go. And so like in this case, if we load this page right here, we refresh, this will do a GET request to the llamapress.ai server with this as the parameters. They call these parameters. These are like input arguments to the URL. And what it will do is it will come in to our controllers and it will say, hey, I have a GET request for /pages/ if you go back to our URL, /pages/ and here's a database ID, /ID /preview. Let's go back to our drawing here, get pages /ID /preview. And this right here is going to be defined in this routes.rb, and it's going to know to map it to the correct controller in the Rails application. So this is a really, really important piece. And what we'll do in the next video is we'll actually start to look at a Rails controller, a Rails view, and a Rails model in our Ruby on Rails application, just to try to get a better kind of intuitive grasp for all of these things. Thanks, and I'll see you in the next video.